In the time I've been making YouTube videos, I've encountered the same story a few times. It's the story of a content creator or entertainer whose fanbase turns on them. I'm fascinated by this story because of the many different ways in which a group of people can grow to hate something they once loved. With Jason Genova, you could say that the fandom was ironic from the start. People came to his videos to laugh at the mentally disabled kid who thought he was going to be a bodybuilding movie star UFC fighter. Over time, Jason's lying and scamming nature, among many other negative behavioral traits, caused a genuine hatred to build in the community that coalesced around his channel. As for Anthony Cumia, he had one of the most devoted fan bases you'll ever see. If you remember the attack on the media, or the numerous fights Opie and Anthony had with other radio shows, you will understand how dedicated the pests were to the show they loved, and Anthony in particular. But all it took for the fans to turn was Anthony's inability to take criticism after a bad roast set. In the case of Brendan Schaub, the turn has been slower and more gradual. It's hard to pinpoint a specific moment that has caused so many people to start hating something they used to enjoy. You could boil it down to Schaub becoming increasingly arrogant and thin-skinned as his fame has grown, but I think that is an oversimplification, and the topic is worth a little more exploration. I think the best place to start this video is with Schaub's MMA debut. Having spent most of his youth and early adulthood attempting an unsuccessful football career, Brendan Schaub came to MMA late in life. However, given the fact that the heavyweight division tends to be an old man's division, 25 years old probably wasn't that late to begin fighting, especially for a relatively athletic guy like Schaub. Despite his age, it should be said that Schaub did show some promise early in his career. In less than a year, he racked up 4 straight wins by knockout or TKO. From here, Brendan would take part in the 10th season of The Ultimate Fighter, which would bring him to the attention of the wider MMA audience. It was a stroke of luck for Schaub, as Season 10 is one of the most noteworthy seasons in the show's history. The all-heavyweight season featured famous Metal Thing avoider Kimbo Slice, as well as the now legendary feud between Rampage Jackson and Rashad Evans. Schaub would do well in the season, finishing all of his fights, and eventually meeting Roy Nelson in the finale. Unfortunately for Schaub, this fight would be the beginning of a tradition of getting knocked out in comical fashion. This was by no means the end for Schaub's UFC career, though. If you are familiar with The Ultimate Fighter, you will know that the runner-up is usually given a chance at competing in the UFC, and Schaub made the best of this opportunity by going on a 4-fight win streak that included wins over Chase Gormley, Chris Tuchscherer, Gabriel Gonzaga, and finally a knockout win over MMA legend Mirko Cro Cop. In my opinion, this was probably the peak of Brendan's career, but it was also the point at which people started expressing animosity towards him. When this fight went down, Cro Cop was definitely past his prime, and he was coming off a knockout loss and a stinker for the ages against Frank Mir. But he was still Cro Cop, one of the most beloved fighters in MMA history. When Schaub delivered a follow-up punch on an already unconscious Cro Cop, it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. The animosity towards Schaub grew in the build-up to his fight with Big Nog at UFC 134 in August of 2011. Nogueira is another MMA icon, and Schaub's attempts to position himself as the legend killer with a win over Big Nog made him seem arrogant in the eyes of many MMA fans at the time. I remember watching this fight live and reading the comments about the fight on MMA websites, and I don't think there was a single person who wasn't overjoyed when Nog flatlined Brendan. In his next fight, Schaub was on the receiving end of a knockout from Ben Rothwell that will live on in memes forever. He was able to bounce back with wins against LeVar Johnson and Matt Mitrione, but then managed to embarrass himself with his performance at Metamoris 2 against Roberto Cyborg Abreu. It's not uncommon for MMA fighters to compete in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu matches against high-level black belts, and nobody would have given Schaub a hard time if he came up short against a top-tier grappler like Abreu. What Brendan did was probably worse than if he looked like an idiot and got submitted in seconds. Brendan refused to engage with Cyborg, and the match was declared a draw. As bad as that is, Schaub's post-fight comments were even more embarrassing.
So your objective was to shut down his game? Yeah, with my training through, Huron and Henry Gracie and Jason Manley, the goal was to shut him down. For me, it was a success. Shutting him down for 20 minutes was a success for Brendan Schaub.
As long as I live as a fighter, I'll never run from a fight like that.
I've never ran.
No problem.
I've never ran. I've shut things down. Ask LeVar Johnson.
The only
Ask
thing.
Mirko Cro Cop.
No problem.
Gabriel Gonzaga.
Well.
I've never ran.
Schaub's 2-fight win streak would be snapped in June of 2014 when he wound up on the wrong side of an incredibly boring decision against Andrei Arlovsky, which brings us to the Travis Browne fight. Now, I've already nitpicked the way Brendan described this fight during his comedy special in another video. The biggest complaint Schaub's defenders had with that video was that, supposedly, every comic lies, and I was overanalyzing jokes. I want to make something clear. I know perfectly well that comedians lie in their sets. One of my favorite comedians is Anthony Jeselnik, and his act is almost entirely made of jokes about things that never actually happened. That is okay, because the lie is in service of making the joke funnier. But with Schaub, the lies he tells during the story of his fight with Travis Browne only serve to make Schaub look better, to make his story seem more heroic, and it's frankly pathetic.
So my dad took me out of that, put me in wrestling. Then from wrestling, I went to jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu to boxing. I'm fully immersed to become the world champion. Fast forward 20 years later, I'm in pursuit of this exact goddamn dream. It's December 6, 2014. We're in Las Vegas, Nevada, MGM Grand. Here we go, man. Since I was 10 years old, I've visualized this exact goddamn night. My name's on the freaking marquee at the MGM Grand. Before me, it was Conor McGregor, Brock Lesnar, Evander Holyfield, Mike Tyson. Now it's my turn.
That being said, I'm not going to nitpick every lie Schaub has told about the Travis Browne fight. I'm only going to focus on one, the biggest one. That is, the way Schaub has painted the fight as the moment he decided he was done fighting and wanted to follow his passion for comedy.
Brian Callen and I took a taxi from Las Vegas, Nevada to Los Angeles, California at 3 in the morning. And we came up with a game plan of me never getting punched in the face again and pursuing my passion of stand-up comedy.
That is simply not true. If you're familiar with Schaub's story, or even just familiar with Joe Rogan, you will probably remember the episode of The Fighter and the Kid that took place after the Travis Browne fight, where Joe viciously tore Brendan down. For just shy of 2 hours, Joe repeatedly told Schaub that he wasn't an elite fighter, wasn't committed to fighting, and suggested he retire before he suffered any more brain damage. I don't like Schaub, but I thought this was a dick move when I saw it in 2014, and I still think it was a dick move after watching it again with the knowledge hindsight provides. I understand the idea of tough love and wanting to be brutally honest with your friends when you think they're making a mistake. But aside from occasionally saying, "You're a funny guy who could do something else," this was a fucking crucifixion. Schaub said at the beginning of the conversation that he didn't want to talk about the fight on the podcast, but felt like he owed it to the fans who stood by him during the loss. That didn't stop Rogan from going in on him like a prison bitch with Kool-Aid on his lips. Anytime Brendan would try to defend himself, Joe would come back twice as hard. He even brought out a Terry Norris impression. This podcast also spawned what is probably the most famous meme related to Brendan Schaub. During one exchange where Brendan was trying to make the case that he could compete with the upper echelon of the UFC heavyweight division, Rogan asked him how he thought he would fare in a pure wrestling match with Cain Velasquez. Brendan replied by saying that he thought people would be surprised, to which Rogan uttered the now legendary response, "I think you'd be surprised. I really do. I think he would fuck you up." This one line has become so intertwined with Schaub that he even used it as the title for his first full-length comedy special. Brendan did raise one good point when he said it was easy for somebody like Joe, who is set for life, to tell somebody without a safety net to gamble with their life and future. Joe took this personally, of course, because he is an out-of-touch multimillionaire who doesn't realize that for every success story like his own, there are 1,000 people in LA who tried to chase their dreams and ended up working at P.F. Chang's. Joe's belief that anybody can drop their soul-crushing 9-to-5 job and start a podcast about bow hunting is one of his traits that I truly hate, but that is a rant for a future series. If I were to speculate, I think Schaub still resents Joe for publicly humiliating him, which is probably why he credits Callen in his special for helping him transition into a comedy career. This is a lie for another reason, though. Brendan didn't retire for nearly a year after his fight with Travis Browne. In his response to Joe Rogan, Brendan said on multiple occasions that he was going to continue fighting. As 2015 went on, he even toyed with the idea of a move to light heavyweight. What ultimately made Brendan retire from MMA was the deal the UFC signed with Reebok. In the future, I'd like to make a video about the Reebok deal, because it is universally considered one of, if not the biggest fuck-up in UFC history.
Ladies and gentlemen, the UFC Kid.
UFC Fight Kit. The United States of America!
Aside from the many hilarious mistakes Reebok made while attempting to roll out their new line of fight kits and other merch, the real issue that didn't sit well with fighters and fans alike was the way the Reebok deal would affect fighter pay. Before the deal, fighters could have a variety of in-ring sponsorships, typically via patches on their shorts. Old school fans will remember some of the classics like Condom Depot and Dude Wipes. Having individual sponsorships meant that fighters could make a ton of money, sometimes as much or more than they would have earned from their purse. When the Reebok deal was implemented, fighters were not permitted to have any other sponsors during fights or fight week. Some fighters were even called out for wearing apparel made by other companies. Matt Mitrione literally did an interview barefoot because the UFC wouldn't allow him to wear Nikes on camera, even though they were just his shoes, not a sponsorship.
Honestly, where are your shoes?
They're outside. I had some J's on my feet, and that was not part of the attire. Really? So I came in barefooted.
The worst part was that fighters were now only making a fixed amount of money based upon the number of fights they had in the UFC. As the Reebok deal was being rolled out, Brendan was one of its most vocal critics. When asked how the Reebok deal would compare to his previous earnings, Brendan claimed that he had made 6 figures in sponsorships for each of his last 6 fights. With the Reebok deal, he would have been losing at least 90% of his pay from sponsorships. Of course, this claim was dismissed by sentient beefsteak tomato Dana White. In a now deleted appearance on Off the Record, Dana tried to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the claim that Schaub was making 6 figures from sponsorships, but the financials were later confirmed by Joe Rogan. Now, it might seem like I took a huge detour, and I did, but I did so for a reason. It's important for people to understand the real reason Brendan retired. When he announced his retirement on the Joe Rogan Experience in October of 2015, he directly cited the money he would have lost from the Reebok deal and the growing success of the Fighter and the Kid podcast. The reason I find this so important to mention is because it isn't just an exaggeration on a comedy special. It's part of a larger pattern of lies, delusional behavior, and general douchebaggery that has been getting worse and worse over time. Whether you love or hate Schaub, it's hard to deny that the man has found a good hustle. The Fighter and the Kid has been very successful and allowed Schaub to branch out into several other podcasts, like The King and the Sting and The Big Brown Breakdown, which later turned into the Below the Belt podcast. He did analysis for Mayweather vs. McGregor, he has his own show on Showtime, and is a cast member of Play by Play on Bravo. Brendan prides himself on his beast of a work ethic, but there is a serious quantity over quality issue here. This is a problem with podcasts in general, but it's especially bad with all of the LA comics who orbit Rogan. They all have 3 podcasts that put out 2 to 3 episodes a week, and they ran out of interesting things to say after about 10 episodes combined. To make matters worse, they're constantly going on each other's podcasts, so if you've seen a handful of podcasts from these people, you've probably heard all of their interesting stories and can predict what they'll say in just about any situation. I personally can't wait for the next Sober October, where Joe brags about how much he can exercise, and they all take turns making fun of Bert's Mickey Mantle jeans. What unnecessarily offensive thing will Ari Shaffir say? Get your laughing hats ready, guys. The problem is more pronounced with Schaub because he is really bad at everything he attempts. The man's career hinges upon speaking, but he can't put together 2 sentences without his brain short-circuiting and firing off some incomprehensible gibberish. I know Brendan has been hit in the head a lot, but the degeneration in his speech over just the last few years has been startling. He used to sound fairly clear-headed and could make a coherent point without too much effort.
You know what? It's a fight. So I'm ready for anything. I think that's a big asset. I'm ready for it to go anywhere, wherever Johnny wants to take it. He can keep if he wants to keep on his feet. That's definitely in my favor. If he wants to go to the ground, that's fine too.
Now he is a hurricane of Vossian mispronunciation and malapropisms that put Ricky from Trailer Park Boys to shame. If I'm trying to be fair to Schaub, he has suffered a ton of concussions, and he was never Conor McGregor or Chael Sonnen to begin with. Brendan's poor oratory skills are the least of his worries, though. He's just an absolutely terrible podcaster. It's the most noticeable during his solo endeavors because he doesn't have a funnier, more talented comedian to carry him. So for the time being, we're going to put the Fighter and the Kid and the King and the Sting to the side and focus mainly on Below the Belt with Brendan Schaub. You would think that a podcast about combat sports would be a cakewalk for a retired MMA fighter, but you would be wrong. For starters, Brendan usually spends the first 20 minutes of an 80-minute podcast talking about his life, his stand-up comedy, or bantering with his Korean manservant. It's so bad that the top comment on any Below the Belt video will be the timestamp for when the fight talk starts. Not that the fight talk is any better. The way this works is that the previously mentioned Korean manservant will set Brendan up with headlines and current events from the combat sports world, and Brendan will give his take on them. How that goes will depend entirely on whether or not Brendan has seen Luke Thomas's most recent video. If he has, Brendan will regurgitate whatever he can remember Luke saying in a patois of brain damage. Somewhere in the middle of this disaster, Brendan will stop talking about fights to painfully read an ad from one of his sponsors. I know these are live reads, but why not practice them a few times beforehand so he doesn't get tongue-tied or otherwise make himself look like a total moron? By the way, these reads are in the middle of the podcast, and usually bring the fight talk to a screeching halt anyway, so other than pure laziness, there really is no reason not to pre-record them and make a few attempts until you find the right take. Either way, once old cauliflower brain is done stumbling through the live read, we get back to the fight talk. Now, if Brendan hasn't seen Luke Thomas's most recent video, he will typically do one of two things. Either he will literally just make his predictions based upon Wikipedia records and betting lines, or he will say whatever idiotic nonsense comes into his mind at the time. Part of this is because he legitimately doesn't know anything about MMA. However, there is another factor at play here. One of Brendan's most infamous gaffes was his accusation that the UFC Tonight panel had been hired because of their race and not their abilities as analysts. To quote Schaub, "Sometimes you look at UFC Tonight and you're like, is that the best panel possible? Or are you just trying to check off the boxes? We get it, UFC Tonight, Fox. You're not racist. We get it. You have an all-black panel. We get it. Whoa, we get it, man. Now I'm going to ask you again. Are those the best brains and speakers for the art to the general audience?" When Daniel Cormier was asked about Brendan's statements during an interview with Bloody Elbow, I think his dissection of Schaub's analytical style hit the nail on the head. Cormier had this to say, quote, "The crazy thing is, Fox doesn't even hire the talent. The UFC puts them in those positions. So I don't really know what was intended with what he said. But Brendan has developed a style where he's shocking people with some of the things that he says. And when you start to do that, you're almost obligated to stay down that path. Sometimes Skip Bayless says things that are just ridiculous, but it's almost like he has to, because that's what we've come to expect from him. It's kind of what he built. I think Brendan has developed that type of style. You know what? It's obviously working for him. He's got a show on Showtime, 2 massively successful podcasts, and a comedy career. I think in this day and age that, oh my god, I can't believe he said that tone is really valuable in the sports community. That's why these debate shows are so popular around the world. You've got one guy speaking facts and the other guy saying random crazy shit, and everybody's like, oh, I can't believe that dude just said that. That type of on-air personality has gotten really big in today's society." End quote. There is a reason they paid Daddy Daniel the big bucks to do commentary and analysis. He's an intelligent and insightful guy, and his breakdown of Brendan is spot on. There are countless examples of Schaub making wild, ridiculous, and sensational predictions, but I'm going to blow my load early with his pre-fight analysis of the Mayweather vs. McGregor boxing match, because it's insane. Some people might come to Brendan's defense by saying this was just one bad take, or that maybe it happened years ago. First of all, even if this was Schaub's only bad take, it's so bad that it should automatically discredit him as an analyst. But more importantly, Brendan doesn't just make bad predictions. He also frequently does a 180 after the fight, and even tries to lie about his initial prediction. Again, there are many examples of this behavior, but I chose these 2 examples because they are pretty current. Therefore, Schaub defenders can't claim that he was just starting out or didn't have the experience he has now. The first example can be seen with Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz, or as Schaub would call him, Anthony Ruiz. Ahead of the fight, Schaub gave Ruiz no chance of beating Joshua. He even said that Deontay Wilder's opponent, Brazil, would be able to knock out Ruiz in 4 rounds. After the fight, Schaub went on Twitter to slam the doubters by tweeting a list of Ruiz's accomplishments that he clearly read off of Wikipedia seconds before posting the tweet. It's like he doesn't understand that we have video of him making these predictions. Another notable example would be Schaub picking Paulie Malignaggi to beat Artem Lobov at Bare Knuckle FC 6, only to flip his opinion during a conversation with Luke Thomas.
My prediction was, and I text my friends, I don't know if I announced this on the show, but my prediction was I thought Paulie was going to piece him up early on and then struggle with his hands. I thought he'd break his hands and then Artem would win via decision. That's why I texted Rogan. I tried texting to you, but my service was bad, so I'll screenshot that for you. That's why I text most people that I thought Artem would win via decision due to Paulie whooping his ass so bad, breaking his hand.
In another interesting twist, Schaub criticized Paulie for spitting in Artem's face, even though Brendan admitted to trying to start a fight with a football teammate in college by spitting in the other guy's face. When that didn't get the teammate to punch him, Brendan threw him through a glass door anyway, a story he was quite proud to tell on The Fighter and the Kid. I have one final example of Schaub making a bad prediction and then flipping after the fight. This one is a bit older, but you'll understand why I chose to use it shortly. For context, this example comes from an episode of The Fighter and the Kid, where Brian and Brendan were making predictions for the fight between Stipe Miocic and Francis Ngannou. This was during the period where Ngannou was at the peak of his hype. He had just turned Alistair Overeem into a horse meat Pez dispenser, and the UFC was measuring his punching power in Ford Escorts. Brian Callen predicted that Stipe was going to be the better boxer in the pocket, and would be able to use his superior wrestling to take down Ngannou at will. As I mentioned earlier, Brendan's shtick when predicting fights is to say the stupidest and most outlandish thing he can think of. So of course he picked Ngannou to win. But more importantly, he belittled Brian's opinion the entire time, mocking Brian for assuming that Ngannou couldn't wrestle, and bringing up some vague rumors about Francis wrestling with the Olympic team. As we now know, the fight went almost exactly as Callen predicted. Of course, Brendan retroactively changed his opinion on the fight after Francis lost. He walked back his claims about Ngannou's wrestling and compared him to Chet Congo. More interesting to me was the way Brendan treated Callen in the first place. He completely belittled him for having the opinion that Stipe was the better fighter, and this isn't a lone incident. Brendan and his fans love throwing around words like hater to minimize criticism by portraying it as jealousy and obsession. But conveniently, this logic doesn't apply to Brendan, who is almost perpetually shitting on something. Just while I was editing this video, I watched episode 480 of The Fighter and the Kid and found this gem where they're talking about teenage professional Fortnite players. As soon as one of the kids mentions that he makes $80,000 a year, you can see the wheel spinning in Schaub's empty brain like it's a Tom and Jerry cartoon. He can't think of anything funny to say though, so he just reverts to the high school jock bully mindset and blurts out, "How many chicks you fuck, bros?" 0. Brendan was still figuring out how to spell giraffe at the same age these kids were winning millions of dollars from playing Fortnite professionally. He is so jealous that he dismisses the idea that it's a grind to play video games for 10 hours a day, even though he brags about the hard work of sitting his fat ass in front of a microphone for an hour and a half a day and then doing 20 minutes at the Comedy Store to work out his material. Let me guess, there is a double standard for a bread truck because he is a comedian. He's not a hater, he's just making jokes. Like all those jokes he made about Ronda Rousey. How many times has the poster child for CTE thrown Ronda under the bus? Whether it be saying he was too much of a man for her, implying she fucked Dana White,
Out of the corner of my eye, I can see my boss at the time, Dana White, my Eskimo brother.
Or making references to his ex-girlfriend who had a threesome with 2 Brazilian dudes. Having spent a great deal of time watching Janoj Kresva, I'm very familiar with this kind of petty jealousy, where the wanksta will try to steal the limelight by inserting himself into other people's business. Schaub insults and bullies people under the guise of comedy. He knows he can get away with shitting on people because he's a former heavyweight UFC fighter and friends with one of the most influential names in comedy. To use Jason Genova in another analogy, I am of the opinion that if he was as intelligent or capable as an average person, he would be dangerous because he is a delusional, compulsive liar with no sense of right and wrong. Brendan isn't that bad, but he is an example of what happens when an insecure, jealous bully is given success and fame and his ego is allowed to grow unchecked by those around him. He's the kind of person who will act like an authority on something he read or watched 5 seconds ago. He will condescend to other people about something he hasn't even seen which covers a topic he doesn't understand. The best example of this behavior might be when Shaw brought up the documentary Icarus, which he mispronounced as Incarus, of course. Even though Shaw didn't know the name of the movie, and had admitted to Rogan that he hadn't even seen it, he still talked down to Bryan about the fact that he had to watch the movie to understand the scope of doping in the Russian Olympic team, then corrected Bryan by saying it wasn't the state, but the country of Russia. From what I've seen, this kind of behavior is the reason a lot of people have been turning on Brendan recently. Rogan and Callen have been lying to him about how funny he is, and his connections to Joe have afforded him opportunities that much funnier comedians only dream of. Just ask yourself this question. If Schaub was not friends with Joe Rogan, do you think he would even be allowed in the Comedy Store, much less have a special on Showtime? Of course, Brendan attributes all of his success to his athletic work ethic, but that is because he has nobody in his life telling him the truth. Joe probably feels like Brendan's Tard Wrangler, and Bryan is too nice to call him out. Theo Von will occasionally roast him, but he knows not to rock the boat too much. None of those lesser-known comedians at the Comedy Store are going to open their mouths either, because they don't want to jeopardize their chance of being on a well-known podcast. Or worse, piss off Uncle Rogan by offending his Make-A-Wish kid. This is how we find ourselves at the point where Brendan's ego has ballooned to its current proportions. His personality is centered around materialism and status symbols. Skinny jeans, ridiculous Japanese shoes, $20,000 Rolexes. He is so obsessed with his appearance that he's probably had lip injections and Botox from what I can tell. And nobody is calling him out, which is how you create a person who views himself as superior to anyone less famous or successful than himself. This mentality is most apparent when Brendan talks about his critics, who he refers to as haters. Brendan doesn't draw any distinction between trolls and people offering genuine criticism. His thin skin and inability to handle criticism has been one of the most common explanations I've seen former fans give as the reason they turned on Schaub. One clip in particular has essentially united all of Schaub's detractors under one banner. In this clip, Schaub portrays all of his critics as haters who live in their mom's basements, then makes the bizarre statement that, like a homeless person, the opinions of his critics don't matter. He later compares online critics to cats, but once again reiterates that homeless people don't matter. This rant has led the denizens of the Fighter and the Kid subreddit to adopt the moniker of homeless cats in their crusade against Schaub. However, it should be said that online critics are not the only ones whose opinions do not matter in Brendan's eyes. He has virtually no respect for anyone who he can't use for the purpose of career or social climbing. Unfortunately, that includes Bryan Callen. I honestly like Bryan. I think he's a funny guy and a solid actor. He was hilarious on Mad TV too, but his comedy career is not doing well lately, and I think you can place the blame squarely on Schaub. Even if you regularly watch stand-up comedy, you probably haven't seen Bryan's last two specials, Never Grow Up and Complicated Apes. Why? Because they're both on Amazon Video on Demand, instead of other services where you typically find stand-up comedy. This is interesting because, from what I've heard, Bryan was in talks with Netflix to release Never Grow Up on their platform. This deal didn't materialize because, somehow, Brendan convinced Bryan to make the monumentally stupid decision to bundle Never Grow Up with the one-season run of The Fighter and the Kid 3D and a t-shirt. There is no way Schaub genuinely believed this bullshit story that Callen was somehow different from other comics and wouldn't benefit from being on one of the major platforms. Because, when Brendan had the opportunity to do a special on Showtime, he jumped on it faster than John Jones jumps out of a car after hitting a pregnant woman.
Once I saw the stage, it hit me that this is a big deal.
It's obvious that Brendan did this to minimize the success of Bryan's special while also attaching his name to Bryan's work and bundling it with his own merch. That is such a disgustingly manipulative thing to do, especially to someone who is supposed to be your friend, the guy who helped you figure out a way to follow your childhood passion in comedy. This is how you repay him? Now, Brendan's career is doing much better than Bryan's. He has multiple podcasts, a special on Showtime, and several TV gigs, while Bryan's special is on Amazon, the Walmart dollar DVD bin of streaming services. As Brendan's fame and success started surpassing Bryan's, he's become increasingly disrespectful. I'm not going to break down how the dynamic of the show has changed over the years, because there are nearly 500 episodes, and I would rather try to make toast in the bathtub than watch any more than I already have. Honestly, you don't need to watch that many episodes of The Fighter and the Kid to see how toxic their relationship has become. If you watch more recent episodes, Brendan constantly tramples Bryan. He hardly lets Callan say one sentence without interrupting. They've even had one pretty substantial blowout, one that stemmed from Brendan accusing Bryan of lying about the street fights he had as a kid because Bryan's family was rich. The problem is that Bryan is too nice. He refrains from saying anything negative about Brendan, even in a joking way, because Brendan is astoundingly thin-skinned for a comic. Compare this with episodes of The Fighter and the Kid featuring Bryan and other comedians like Will Sasso and Chris D'Elia. In my opinion, they're much more enjoyable than Callan and Schaub because Bryan can actually open his mouth. Of all of Brendan's terrible traits, I think the bullying of Bryan is probably the worst, because this is a man who helped Brendan become a comedian. Sure, Joe Rogan's influence has probably smoothed a lot of career speed bumps, but Bryan was the one who initially helped Brendan get a foot in the door of stand-up comedy.
Bryan Callen and I took a taxi from Las Vegas, Nevada to Los Angeles, California at 3 in the morning. And we came up with a game plan of me never getting punched in the face again and pursuing my passion of stand-up comedy.
Without Bryan, Brendan would still be getting his head punched in for a living. Brendan is now the successful one. But unlike Callan, he's clearly uncomfortable with helping somebody who has outlived his usefulness. I've already said a lot about Schaub in this video, and I've tried to cover the meat and potatoes and nuts of this entertainment stew. We haven't devoted much time to talking about comedy yet, though. It's a tougher task than you might imagine, because there is very little video of Brendan doing stand-up. His Showtime special is basically the only footage we have. There are more clips from You'd Be Surprised on YouTube than the rest of the videos of Brendan doing stand-up combined. When I made my Amy Schumer documentary, I talked about how I thought Amy's comedy career was rushed to build her into a star, but Amy had been doing stand-up for nearly 10 years by the time she was given her first hour-long special. It's true that most of the material was recycled from a previous album and Comedy Central Half Hour, but at least she had the experience of doing a set on Live at Gotham, appearing on Last Comic Standing, as well as producing an album and a half-hour special. Brendan not only got a special in less than half the time it took Schumer, he never had to prove himself the way other comics do. Even Rogan said he thought Brendan did the special too soon. The truth is, Brendan didn't get a Showtime special because he's funny or such a hard worker. He got a special because of his friends and his name value. He's basically the CM Punk of comedy. An outsider whose fame allowed him to bypass the vetting process that weeds out people who aren't ready for the big show. The difference between Schaub and Punk is that MMA fighters didn't have to hold their tongue when they thought Punk was making a mockery of the sport. For up-and-coming comics, there is a huge risk associated with trashing Rogan's charity case. I'm not a comic, but I have nothing but sympathy for those people who have to sit in the green room at the Comedy Store and pretend they don't hate this lummox who got to sail past everyone else because his comedy career has training wheels. This is the problem I have with people who come to his defense by saying, "Of course he isn't very good. He's only been doing this for 4 years. Why should we go easy on him?" I could see it differently if he was like Steve-O or Mick Foley, but Brendan was the one calling himself a stand-up comic, even though he didn't even know George Carlin's name. Brendan was the one bragging about all the work he was putting in, all the shows he was doing. Every time he was on Rogan's podcast, they would have one of their insufferable fucking conversations about stand-up and the business of show. He wanted to be seen as a legitimate comedian. So why should we treat him like the kid with Down syndrome who was allowed to score a touchdown? Honestly, he had no business doing a special with this little experience. If he had done a few smaller sets, and somebody was actually truthful with him, I think Brendan might have been able to whittle these stories down into a passable 15 to 20 minutes. In spite of all the many problems I have with Schaub's retelling of the events of the Travis Brown fight, I think it is the most refined part of his special. Probably because he practiced it in other performances, like This Is Not Happening, but Schaub blaming his father for forcing him to be a UFC fighter when Brendan really wanted to be a comedian is only half of the special. To get to that story, you have to sit through over half an hour of mind-numbingly boring material. That's the real issue with the special. It's not like The Room. There are a few moments of legendary cringe, but it's not so bad that it's good. You'd be surprised it's mostly just boring, because Schaub stretches mundane events into 5-minute-long stories with no payoff. He tells one joke about being picked up by an Uber in Texas, and the biggest joke is that the driver looked like a sweet potato with eyes.
Jerry looked like a sweet potato with eyes. Did you eat all the barbecue in Texas?
Or maybe it was the 7 other tepid punchlines shoehorned into the bit for no reason other than to drag the story out some more. Beyond the jokes themselves, his tempo is terrible, his delivery sucks, and he makes up for mediocre punchlines with embarrassing physical comedy.
He was Asian as shit. Dicey.
And this is what his material looks like with the help of ghostwriters.
So Derek and Hassan, they're 2 door guys at the Comedy Store, 2 beast comics, 2 creative dudes. So every Thursday we get together, they go over their sets, I go over my sets, and we just have like this workshop. And
when he can't find a ghostwriter to help him, Brendan just steals shit from other people. In one of the threads on the Fighter and the Kids subreddit, someone described Brendan's personality as an underwhelming Frankenstein, and I think that is a perfect description. He's always stealing something from one of his funnier friends. Joe Rogan's laugh, D'Elia's lazy speak. Where the thievery becomes indefensible to me is when he starts doing it in his act.
You know my favorite food is? Fajitas. I love fajitas. Do you like fajitas? You ever get those? Yeah, you do, right? They're good. Because it's more than a meal. It's very exciting. When you order a fajita, you order them, and then a couple minutes later, they bring them out, and it is loud.
I want that same feeling? I go to Chili's and order fajitas. You know what I'm talking about. You order those fajitas, it's fucking poppin'.
Smoke. It's like 4th of July. Everyone's like, oh my God. What is that? What the fuck is that?
Those fajitas hit the floor, it's all. And like, what the fuck? Come on. Right here, bitch. Right here.
Then it turns into an arts and crafts project. Another level of excitement. Tortillas, you have all these little sour cream, guac.
Making it rain with tortillas now and shit.
In spite of all of this, I still think the cardinal sin Schaub committed was a story he told about the giant Asian doctor who fixed his lip after the loss to Travis Brown.
This giant Asian doctor walks up to him and goes, Mr. Schaub, I'm sorry for your loss. And he takes out the biggest syringe you've ever seen in your life, like he's out of a goddamn comic book. Goes, Mr. Schaub, after you numb your lip, you need many, many stitches. This be worst pain in your life, guaranteed. Worst pain in your life.
My name is Dr. Greg Shue. I'm a board-certified ophthalmologist.
I am the UFC consultant physician. I take care of all the fighters as well as employees within the UFC family, making sure that their eyes are good to go before and after a fight.
In my review of You'd Be Surprised, I said that clip is probably the cringiest thing I've ever seen, and I stand by that. But it actually gets worse. When I was doing research for this video, I saw Brendan tell this same story on The Fighter and the Kid, and that version was a little different than the one he told in his special. So Schaub knew Dr. Shue didn't have a stereotypical Asian accent, but decided to give him one during his act for comedic effect. Because fuck that guy, I guess? This isn't even a case that you can defend as an attempt at humor through exaggeration. Shue speaks better English than Schaub does. If you're gonna go this far, why not just tape your eyelids back while you're at it? I'm not someone who gets easily offended by racial jokes, but this really rubs me the wrong way. On top of being racist, it doesn't add anything to the joke, and it's mocking some random guy who seems pretty chill to me. What made Schaub think this was a good idea? And how did this get by Joe Rogan? He must have heard this bit and known that Dr. Shue doesn't sound like Mickey Rooney from Breakfast at Tiffany's. Why didn't he put a stop to this, or at least call Schaub out? Joe, you were there when you thought Schaub should stop fighting. Where were you when he was making these potentially career-altering mistakes? I'm not trying to make wild predictions like Brendan does, but I think You'd Be Surprised will go down as one of those mistakes that permanently damages a career. This has to be the most universally hated special since Amy Schumer's Leather special, maybe even surpassing it. You'd Be Surprised actually has a slightly worse rating on IMDb than the Leather special. I'll remind you that this is after the CBD oil company Brendan is affiliated with bribed his fans into leaving positive reviews by offering a 50% off coupon on Full Spectrum products. Even with his ball washers artificially inflating his ratings in exchange for a discount on snake oil, You'd Be Surprised still has less than 3 stars on IMDb and a 9% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but I think the true rating would be much worse. That being said, Brendan will probably get another special, because he does have name value and is close friends with Joe Rogan. He does sell out clubs, and has a successful brand, but there is a stink on him now. Special or no special, we've reached a point where people are no longer willing to tolerate Schaub's bullshit. the same way they have for years. Some comedians are finally starting to speak out about it. In particular, the superior comedian/MMA fighter duo of Luis J. Gomez and Michael Bisping have been taking shots at Schlabo for months.
Your hair looks good, by the way. I will say, I will compliment it. It looks very good.
No, I will say this. Giovanni, that was his name. Giovanni from Funks. I'm not throwing you under a bus. You did a good job. The fade was decent. No, he wasn't black guy. No,
Asian.
He was
Asian.
No, he wasn't. No.
Other MMA fighters are trashing Schaub as well. Fellow former UFC heavyweight and friend of the Homeless Cats, Sean Big Sexy McCorkle, misses no opportunity to bash Brendan on Twitter, Instagram, or Reddit. Sean's social media disses are funnier than anything Schaub has done in his 4 years as a professional comedian. Even Callan has been fighting back a little bit lately, and Brendan can't handle it. The crucial change that is now taking place is that fans are starting to see Brendan for who he really is and turning on him. In a move similar to the revolt of the Opie and Anthony subreddit against Anthony Cumia, the Fighter and the Kid subreddit has soured on Brendan over the years, and is now devoted almost entirely to trashing Brendan and archiving all of his worst moments. The animosity toward Schaub has spread beyond the Cheeto dust-covered homeless cats of Reddit, though. Earlier this year, he earned the moniker Stream Snitch Schaub because, after he repeatedly mentioned our MMA streams, the subreddit was shut down. To be honest, I don't think Brendan was the reason our MMA streams was banned, but it's pretty hypocritical that such a vocal advocate for fighter pay would illegally stream pay-per-view events, especially in light of his other wasteful spending habits. Brendan has been a laughingstock in the MMA community for years, but his hypocrisy and the sensationalist style of MMA analysis I mentioned earlier is wearing increasingly thin with MMA fans. His take on Jon Jones' most recent legal troubles drew a fair amount of backlash, because Schaub cast doubt on the accusations of a cocktail waitress against Jones due to the fact that she goes by Cinnamon. To which people replied that Schaub calls himself a comedian and actually named his son Tiger. Brendan will always have a core group of 80 IQ sycophants who live vicariously through his lifestyle and call anyone who criticizes him a hater. I don't think I'll ever get through to them because, well, they're stupid. And they genuinely buy into the philosophy that Schaub regurgitates about negativity and haters. But I want to try. I want to end this video by talking about an event that encapsulates who Brendan is as a person. The story begins with UFC fighter Ray Borg. In early 2018, Borg's son was diagnosed with hydrocephalus and underwent multiple surgeries within the first months of his life. The medical bills were so large that Borg was forced to open a GoFundMe page and considered quitting MMA to get a regular job. Many members of the MMA community came to Borg's aid, but there was one who stood out from the rest. On the JRE MMA show number 43, Schaub said that he would pay for Ray Borg's son's medical bills, and later stated the profits from his upcoming shows in Utah would be donated to Borg. It sounds like an incredibly selfless thing for Schaub to do, but as far as I know, we've never seen any confirmation that he did. For one thing, we know that other fighters like Chael Sonnen and Cody Garbrandt helped Borg out. And Cash App, one of the sponsors for the Joe Rogan Experience, set up a referral code that would donate $5 to Borg's son's medical bills. This referral code was still being promoted by Rogan months after Schaub said he would take care of Ray Borg. Borg did later give a statement vaguely saying that Schaub is a man of his word and helped raise family in a tremendous way.
You know, he obviously publicly showed interest about wanting to help my family, you know, and you know, he abided by his word, you know, that he helped my family out, and neither of us cared about making it known.
But that is a lot different than saying, yes, he covered my son's medical bills. To be fair to Schaub, donating any amount of money to pay for an infant's medical bills is a good thing. I'm not taking away from that act. It just leaves a bad taste in my mouth that Schaub continues to say that he took care of Ray Borg's son's medical bills, when we know he wasn't the only one donating. He wasn't even the only MMA fighter, but he was the only one bragging about it on multiple podcasts. He was the only one using a sick child's medical bills to sell at his comedy shows. I don't think Brendan is a bad person, but I don't think he does things out of the goodness of his heart either. Whether or not he actually took care of Borg is immaterial to the fact that he used the situation to boost his standing in the MMA community.
I'm a good person. I'm a good fucking person, man.
Like, I donate. A guy I don't even know, his son was having horrible brain problems. I covered his medical bills. Like, dude, I'm a good guy, man.
It wasn't enough to quietly approach Borg the way Joe Rogan recently did with Miriam Nakamoto to cover the cost of her stem cell treatment, or the way Dana White did when he donated $50,000 to save the life of the daughter of a teacher at Tiger Muay Thai. Schaub had to let everyone know that he was going to take care of Borg, to look like the good guy. That one action tells you more about Brendan's character than you'll learn from thousands of hours of podcasts and all the lies in his comedy special combined. This is where my original documentary about Brendan Schaub ended, and I suppose it would be an acceptable point to end this version as well. However, there is one event that occurred since I made my original video that I think is worth mentioning here. In early September, Brendan made a comment on The King and the Sting, saying that he knows some bald dudes who are slinging dick out there. And the examples he used were Dana White and Joe Rogan. People were quick to recognize the implications of saying that married men are out slinging dick, especially because rumors about cheating have swirled around Dana White for years, including accusations from his own mother that he was sleeping with his sister-in-law. And there is the legendary video shot by Colby Covington, which shows Dana White at a casino with a young woman of unknown provenance. Ironically, though, Rogan is the one with the documented history of infidelity, as he admitted to cheating on his ex-girlfriend, Jerry Manthe.
And then you said, oh, she's a good person.
Yeah.
Yeah, how good is she if you broke up with her?
Actually, I broke up with him.
You did break up with him?
I did.
What did you do? Why did you break up with him? Was he bad in bed?
No, actually, he's quite good in bed.
He's a good-looking guy, Joe.
I'm in.
See?
All right. That's all you need.
That's all you have to say. You can say anything else about him now.
I don't want to badmouth him.
Why?
Come on, what did he do?
We're friends.
Because
I told you we're
those
friends.
are old times, and I've forgiven him for hurting me.
Isn't it? But how did he hurt you? Did he cheat on you? He did. Yeah.
Joe!
Oh, Joe!
Way to go!
Oh.
What is your problem?
Yeah, but why the cheating?
Because I want to have sex with other chicks.
Which would have been fine if he had just told me that's what he wanted.
Well,
didn't she satisfy you?
She's a very pretty girl and she's very good in bed. It had nothing to do with it. It was just the fights.
Where this gets really interesting is that after people started picking up on Brendan's comments, episode 35 of The King and the Sting was taken down, and the slinging dick segment was removed. Some YouTubers, like Saiyans Entertainment, also had their videos containing the clip copyright claimed and blocked by Bent Pixels, which only adds further evidence to the claim that Bent Pixels is being used by Rogan and Schaub to silence people who criticize them. Brendan later addressed the issue on Below the Belt, stating that nothing he says in any of his podcasts should be quoted because they're not serious. He went on to say that the use of slanging dick was misinterpreted, and that he really just meant it as an analog for success. Which may be true for all I know, but he has made other comments about Bryan Callen cheating on his wife in the past. Maybe he just likes making jokes about his friends cheating because he's an asshole who enjoys putting other people down whenever he has the opportunity to do so. Whatever the case may be, it's just another in the litany of Schaub's blunders and public embarrassments, a pattern I expect to continue for a very long time. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. I don't know if this video will stay up, but I thought it was worth another try, especially with how hard Rogan and Schaub have been censoring other people. I know that this video is lacking a lot that made the original work, but there is only so much I can do without including the clips that Bent Pixels would claim. This is the next best thing, and I hope you enjoyed it. I would also like to thank my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you, Bones CK, Colin Donahue, Mike Roballs, CP, Kevin Howard, Origami Fleshlight, Medication Doesn't Work, The Son of Man, Neem, and Jackie.